welcome to the Podish-Sortacast from FtB, where a bunch of bloggers join up and basically just talk instead of blog. We're trying to stretch our limits a little bit, get a little bit beyond our things. I'm going to be your host, HJ Hornbeck. With me as well is Christian.
Yeah, hello. I'm Christian Wager. I have the blog ProScience, and this is a subject near and dear to me, even though I don't blog enough about it, as all of us don't.
Indeed. Yeah, I'm on Reprobate Spreadsheet, and this is one that I hugely adore. I actually was one of the people who proposed this topic as well. Today we're going to be talking about the nuts and bolts of skepticism, sort of the little details which sort of form the skeptic movement in some sense, the theoretical and philosophical underpinnings of it, if you will. It's certainly a good break from talking about the drama and all that, which does engage with that. So when I think of sort of the nuts and bolts of it, one of the first things that comes to mind for me is Carl Sagan's Baloney detection kit. I don't know if you're aware of it at all. Basically, just give it a quick Google and bring it up there. I'll try and pop it into the chat once I get a moment to actually sort of get everybody on the same page for that. But Carl Sagan himself sort of developed it about 3 odd decades ago and all that. Given what we know now, with the benefit of hindsight, how well has it stood up over the test of time? Let's have a quick discussion on it. And in fact, I'm actually going to go over it point by point. Let's start with actually that very first bullet point within Carl Sagan's text. He's got 9 tools in total, 9 sort of tools in total. So let's start off with number 1 right here. Quote, wherever possible, there must be independent confirmation of the facts. And facts is in the text in air quotes.
Yeah, well, that sounds, that's a bit vague. Whenever possible is always an opt-out phrase, but it is, it's a very sound principle that if somebody make a claim, and a weird and extraordinary claim, and nobody else can back them up, the probability of it being true is less likely than otherwise. Not saying that a weird and improbable claim backed up by a lot of people is not still unlikely to be true, but of course, you have to take it more seriously then.
Exactly. Now actually would be a good point to introduce Satan. Satan, would you like to introduce yourself and your blog on FtB?
So I may be aware of a technical issue related to the what's going on with the broadcast right now. Some people were at the wrong Zoom meeting, I think. PZ and Sarah.
We're here now. We found it.
Huzzah! There you are. And it looks like my internet connection, since it fell off completely and came back, seems to be doing better. Not much to say about me. I'm fairly undereducated and unqualified to speak on anything, except insofar as I've got a head on my shoulders and gray matter between my ears.
That's okay. We're just detecting baloney, so, low bar.
Let's proceed with us.
Yeah, functional textbook should be good enough. All right, while we're here, let's do introductions for PZ Myers and Sarah as well, too.
Oh, okay. Yeah, I'm still kind of in a bit of shock from the sudden departure from one distant location to another one, but okay. So I'm PZ Myers. I'm a biologist at the University of Minnesota, and I have been a card-carrying skeptic for a long time until I finally got disgusted with the skeptic movement and left. But I'm still a skeptic, so...
You're just not
sure
moving.
You're not talking about atheism now? I see you heard something similar.
Yeah, there's a significant distinction between atheism and the atheist movement, and skepticism and the skeptic movement, and they often don't align very well. The skeptic movement, for instance, it's dominated by libertarian jerks right now. The Michael Shermer style skeptic, and I want nothing to do with it, but I'm still going to be a proud skeptic.
All right, let's go over to Sarah then. Sarah, give yourself an intro.
Hello, I'm Sarah. And I post as Dr. Sarah on the Geeky Humanist blog over on Free Thought Blogs. I'm a GP in Great Britain, and I like to think of myself as a skeptic, but I see that as more of an individual description rather than seeing myself as part of a skeptic movement. So I think I don't actually know if I have any major things to add on the Thought of Skeptic movements, and I'm looking forward to seeing what other people think and if the viewers have any questions for us.
Great. All right, I'll be monitoring the chat definitely, but in the meantime, we were talking about Carl Sagan's Baloney detection kit. I'll just remind you of what the first bullet point of the 9 bullet points that were in that kit itself. Quote, wherever possible, there must be independent confirmation of the facts. And again, the air quotes are in the original too. So Christian has weighed in. Satan, PZ, or Sarah weigh in as well too.
I'm going to look up this excuse me, Baloney detector, because I haven't actually read it for myself yet. So give me a quick second to Google.
No worries.
Independent confirmation strikes me as something that has been subverted quite thoroughly by the means by which people disseminate BS on social media. So that's a little tricky one to use these days.
Well, yeah, it's independent confirmation by whom? Certainly. Like, I mean, certainly the Russian government is confirming a lot of things right now, a lot of facts. Whether or not they have any grounding in reality is, of course, up for debate. Probably not, but I mean, there's a lot of wiggle words for what I'm going to say for this one. Essentially, independent confirmation and facts. A lot really hinges on how you define those two. What is a widely considered fact? Something like tectonic plates, for instance. It was an obscure thing. It's now sort of routinely propped up as sort of something which should be common knowledge and all that. But I mean, at some point it wasn't factual, and then it sort of was. So what actually sort of constitutes fact in that regard? And also confirmation by whom, per se?
Yeah, I would add another complication here is that when we talk about facts, there's a body of facts that align to lead us to a particular conclusion. So, for example, on climate change, the core facts are things like CO2 is a greenhouse gas. Are you going to deny that? Anybody who denies that is just out there. That we have a record of changing temperatures over time, and we can see that they're rising, and it correlates with the Industrial Revolution and the rise of industrial processes that are spewing all these gases into the air. So you could say maybe that you dissent from some small point here and there in the record, but the conclusion that we've got climate change and global warming going on is kind of unavoidable. So that's when you talk about facts, the fact that you can find little bits here and there that might cause you to doubt some aspect of the final conclusion should not lead you to doubt the ultimate conclusion.
That actually leads well into the second point within the Baloney detection toolkit. Quoting from it again, encourage substantive debate on the evidence by knowledgeable proponents of all points of view. I mean,
I think we run into some of the similar problem we've seen in medicine, where evidence is not enough. I mean, I like the science-based medicine. People's take on it is, if you can't explain it by science, or if it flies against science, then no matter how much evidence you have, it's probably not right. Then you're probably bending kind of yourself to. So if climate change is an interesting one, because I mean, if it didn't happen, we would have to rethink a lot of basic chemistry and physics and even biology, actually. So that's a simple one. But the other ones, you would just have to say, no matter how much evidence we have, it's just not possible by the the physics we know now or the biology we know now. It could be a revolution, but quite often it's not.
Well, and also debate is kind of a loaded word too. I mean, the classic example of that, for instance, is creationists and their debates as well. That, that's, I mean, PZ, you know more about this than me, but there's very different types of debates, and some debates are more useful than others,
Yeah, relevant to that, one of the key points in Sagan's point number 2 is that business is about knowledgeable people, just having knowledgeable people discuss this. And that's sometimes a problem because in the creationist debates, for example, creationists are not knowledgeable about evolution at all. In fact, what a common strategy for dealing with them is showing that they don't understand the core principles of evolutionary biology. So that should disqualify them right away. But what you find is often people substitute a degree for that business of actually knowing the science behind something. So you see a lot of creationists who go out and get a master's or a PhD in the field specifically so they can come back and claim authority in debates when they haven't really mastered the material anyway.
I feel like a lot depends on how you're interpreting the word debate. That obviously I'm gonna deduce that what Carl Sagan meant was people are interchanging views, listening to other people's views, saying, okay, that's a good point, but I disagree with you on this one because of X, Y, and Z, and that sort of exchange of views. But then you have the kind of performative debates that take place on YouTube or in public fora, and they're about winning or scoring points. And everyone is just trying to make their case the best way they can. And ironically, the people who know what they're talking about often end up being at a severe disadvantage because you've got the people who are basically just ready to come out with whatever baloney they can, as long as they can make it sound good. And this is why you actually have the term McGish Gallup, named the infamous creationist, for just throwing out as much rubbish as he can as quickly as possible so that you just do not have time to debunk it all. And in terms of this is a debate, as in two people are standing up and trying to make their case, then they're, that's a winning strategy. In terms of beating human knowledge any further or having a useful exchange of ideas, it's absolutely terrible.
Another term that's relevant here is denialism. That there are a lot of people who, when you get into these kinds of debates you're talking about, the waste of time, let's make gotcha points debate. What you often have to deal with is people who outright deny the facts. And then you have to basically give a remedial education in what the actual evidence is to them. And now, I know for a fact that lecturing to people about fine details of science is a good way to put them to sleep. So that's another strategy they use, is just deny, say that's all wrong, claim there's no evidence that vaccines prevent serious disease. And then what do you do in these debates?
I think
a point where debate is just not fruitful at all, and you have to move on and discuss with people who are actually willing to listen.
Yeah, I think that the major point here, if this point should be useful, has to be debated among people who are actually willing to be convinced by arguments and facts. So for this, so debate in this case have to be narrowed into actually, as we said, not just a performative, or even heated debate. You have to actually speak with people who can be convinced. The debate has to be. I mean, and in some sense, it's kind of classic debate. How many angels could dance at the top of a pin? I don't think we're the right people for that kind of debate. We have a fundamental that debate. So, and when we're talking science, we don't need people who actually don't believe in science. That's not people to have a debate with.
Right, or people who redefine science to suit their needs.
Especially authoritarians and such, which bleeds into the next one too. Let's go with point 3 here. Arguments from authority carry a little weight. Authorities have made mistakes in the past. They will do so again in the future. Perhaps a better way to say it is that in science there are no authorities. At most, there are experts.
So that's an interesting distinction. Yeah, people don't have authority just because someone else has invested them with it. Or rather, I think what I'm trying to say is authority is something that you can be invested in with by someone else, but expertise is something you have to learn for yourself. I mean, we could randomly appoint someone as being the authority over evolutionary science, but unless they've actually put in a lot of work to know what they're talking about, then they're not an expert. So that's probably the difference. Useful distinction.
Well, there's actually a very, I mean, it's not what he's talking about, but there's actually an interesting point in the more narrow fields of science that for when they start out, they usually have this authority person who kind of is the leading role. And it turns out that, of course, they move the whatever field forward a lot, but at a certain stage, they actually become a hindrance towards the advancement of the field. So would they leave by death or retirement, the field suddenly actually have a renaissance and actually move along really well. And it's been shown again and again and again. PC, you might actually have no concrete examples. I can't remember any on the top of my head.
Well, it's what it is that science is inherently conservative. And people don't like to hear that, especially us liberals, but and progressives. But yeah, fundamentally, the way science works is extremely conservative. That you have to work really hard to get somebody to change their minds about something. So that leads to this kind of inertia in responses that go on. And for specific examples, I would from evolutionary biology, I would say things like nearly neutral theory, which is still getting a lot of resistance from certain people, but it's mathematically so well established and so strong that whenever you run into somebody who's arguing with it, you just feel like, what is wrong with you? What have you been missing out in the last, I guess it's 50 years, 40 years? No, 50 years. It's 2022, isn't it? So yeah, it's been a long time that this has been out there. And again, it's because you've still got a lot of people who were trained before people like Oda came up with these ideas, and they're clinging to those. I can tell you for myself, my own personal experience, most of what I do, I don't need to do the cutting edge stuff. So I can focus on stuff that was developed 40, 50 years ago, and just do that. Yeah, everyone's waiting for me to die, right?
Ouch. All right. Well, we do have another bullet point to go through, but it is worth sort of discussing something that came up in the chat too. I think it was Hemi Scott actually brought up a form of skepticism that goes beyond challenging a particular truth claimant to challenging the notion of truth itself. Seems to be where aspects of postmodernism ran aground during the science wars, or at least that was the perception. I don't know. I have a fair affinity for postmodernism itself. I think it's quite widely misunderstood and misrepresented. It essentially just sort of boils down to using the skeptical method. Probably the worst thing I can think about is it's sort of skepticism reinvented by skeptics, and it often sort of tends to take the easy way out. It's challenging ideas and creating that, but not really sort of giving any sort of foundation to grow back on. So, no, I don't know if run aground is necessarily the proper thing. And, again, still very much in favor of postmodernism theory in general, but it's not without its problems too.
I have a thought on postmodernism or two. It's obviously a pretty complicated subject, and there's its definition can actually encompass more than one aspect and such. But there is one tiny little aspect of postmodernism which I think has been kind of adopted by even people that see themselves as opponents of postmodernism, which is this idea that different perspectives are valid. Like that's like taken to an extreme is that basically like the only everybody can have their own truth. So that's why we get into like, you know, like people that are just arch conservative, like ultra fascists or whatever, just like falling back on that, like, well, this is just matter of my opinion when they're having a debate with somebody when they come down to a difference of values. Like, mm, yeah, it's their postmodernism is moving past the idea that there's an objective truth, and like particularly news channels, the way they like get away with showcasing fascist talking points is by saying people are saying, well, it's a fact that people are saying this, but is there any actual that they're saying? I'm just gonna ignore that. It's all opinion. And I think that's it's funny to me that people that are right now using the phrase postmodern as a bogeyman are people that actually fully embrace that aspect of it. So it's, yeah, weird world.
Yeah, and I think that's a bit of a pessimistic reading, but I mean, it's that's the thing. Most people claim are postmodernists would actually deny they're postmodernists. So it was a nebulous definition to begin with. You know,
Yeah, but to get back to Hemi Scott's comment, I mean, he says challenging the notion of truth itself. But the thing is, as long as I've been in science, and look how gray I am, it's been a long time. Anyway, as long as I've been in science, there's been an understanding that we have never possessed the truth, you know, in capital letters. All we can do is approximate the truth. And so, and I think that's different from somebody who's just saying, well, it's my opinion, therefore you have to respect it. We're saying, okay, everything is kind of labile and you have to be accommodating to the evidence. And that's what we understand as the truth, is something we work towards, but don't possess right this instant. And is that postmodernism? I don't think that's postmodernism.
There's a common thought perception, I think, from outside of science that for people that do believe that there's something like an objective reality, that that science would be their assumption is that science is the can actually point you directly to it instead of just giving you like a glimpse of it through the screen of understanding.
Yeah.
And I mean, certainly that's what I believed just based on my, you know, what I was absorbing as a youth when I was a child, is that like, well, there's an objective reality. I can see something, it's there. I just based on like some people are saying that like God did everything. That doesn't make much sense to me. These other people are saying, hey, we observed this ball, it's red. That must be the science side. They're just basically saying how things are. That must be the objective truth. So it's like people that have sort of a faith in science, they're kind of assuming that you're pointing to something that actually can be fully understood or believed or verified as fact.
Yeah. Well, you know, but the thing is, I'm willing to concede that I personally believe there is an objective truth to the universe. There's something there, but that, you know, we are human beings with limited perception and limited ability to think about things. And so we can only converge slowly on it. And I think this has been the sort of the standard view in science since Francis Bacon, that truth is not something we can grasp. It's something we have to work towards. And that, you know, Bacon's methods are all about, hey, let's abandon the notion that we know it all right now and just sort of incrementally work through empiricism to get a better picture of how the world works.
I agree that there's nothing kind of contradictory in that belief of a objective truth and actually believing that we don't know it. And also, I mean, as far as I understand, and this is I clearly am way outside my field, but as far as I understand, astronomy is currently going through a major rewrite of everything, because the whole dark matter and dark energy and the proportions of the in the universe is seriously at odds with what we know. So historically, we don't know anything, which must be interesting and weird if you've been working your whole life thinking we actually move forward, and now we suddenly had to go back to, if not exactly point zero, then then quite a bit. So I actually would love somebody who actually knew more about that to chime in about that.
Yeah, we need Mano here, somebody, some physicist to pop in.
I mean, I studied so I could fake it, but I mean, we do have to get back on track with our baloney detection kit. And the next one actually is somewhat relevant too, since it's about, quote, spin more than one hypothesis. If there's something to be explained, think of all the different ways in which it could be explained. Then think of tests by which you might systematically disprove each of the alternatives. What survives the hypothesis that resists disproof in this Darwinian selection amongst multiple working hypotheses has a much better chance of being the right answer than if you had simply run with the first idea that caught your fancy. This sort of gets into what we were just talking about, where science doesn't have the ultimate truth, although it is trying to work towards that truth. Sagan is definitely very much on that side.
But this one is often misunderstood to be that baloney that Sherlock Holmes always say, right? So what is implausible, we have to accept that as truth, right? And this is very clearly not what he's saying. It is hypothesis that's actually we have to have several, but we don't have to believe that is the truth if we only have one left. We might also have overlooked some. And I think that's a very important fact to remember always, so we don't buy into the Sherlock Holmes nonsense.
No, that's actually one of my big complaints against how modern science is sort of carried out, the sort of frequentist, especially Fisherian sort of frequentist style, where you've got one hypothesis and you're trying to prove that it's false. You know, prove in the sense that it's carried beyond a certain threshold and all that. You're not really considering multiple hypotheses in that case. It's sort of like coming along and saying, okay, well, I'm going to drop a pen to the ground, observing it and seeing that it doesn't quite follow the Newtonian mechanics, and therefore concluding, well, that must be because Aristotle's view of gravity is true. When in fact, all that happened is you didn't take into account air resistance. It's the whole, spin more than a hypothesis, cool. Make sure you're spinning as many hypotheses as you can, just to sort of capture the full range of what could potentially be true.
Yeah, we're hearing that what I'm thinking is, oh man, Carl Sagan must have written an awful lot of NSF grants, because that's exactly how you have to think when you're writing these grant proposals. Is you can't go in with, oh, here's my cherished hypothesis and I will do an experiment to prove it is correct. No, that never works. What you have to do is go in with a battery of hypotheses and you say, okay, here's how I will incrementally and progressively knock out 1 and then 2 and then 3 and then 4. And then you don't necessarily say, well, whatever's left over is correct. It's whatever is left over is going to be the subject of my next grant proposal, when I will propose a new set of hypotheses to plumb deeper into that one.
All right, well, let's move on to the next point then. Number 5. Try not to get overly attached to a hypothesis just because it's yours. It's only a way station in the pursuit of knowledge. Ask yourself why you like the idea. Compare it fairly with the alternatives. See if you can find reasons for rejecting it. If you don't, others will. Honestly, I don't have much problems with this one. I think this one is still quite accurate. The only thing is, do we actually do that in practice? I mean, I'm sure all of us can actually point to a lot of, skeptics who were just refused to let go of their original hypotheses and consider alternative views. Like I'm remembering, Shermer's interview with Abigail Schreier, for instance, where a ton of transphobia was shared and misinformation and all that. And I remember an interview later on where he was with, I forget what her name is, from Fox News. He was on her podcast, doing an interview. And she asked him, hey, you've had some feedback and critique on, Schreier's views. What do you have to say? What do you have to say on that? And Shermer's very much like, well, yeah, I've listened to it. And basically everybody else was just completely, biased and, not repeating anything useful. Schreier had made a very good case and was very strong with it and supported all her views, exemplary. Which, if you actually look into Abigail Schreier's book, is completely the opposite of truth. It's astonishing just how much shoddy science she has in here, and yet here is Shermer saying, "Yeah, no, I don't see anything wrong with the evidence she presented." It's just.
But I mean, he's a good marker for wrong. So if he embraces something and that I believe in, I will definitely try to take another look at it.
Yeah, and I mean,
it seems to hold up pretty well. Yeah.
Yeah, and I mean, I pick on him, but a lot of other skeptics are like this. So.
Yeah, but actually, as I said, it is actually a good marker to remind yourself once in a while that maybe you should look at it. I have an old story that when I was younger, there was a lot of articles on the internet about Diet Coke, how bad it was, like the aspartame and all that causing cancer and stuff. And at one stage, I had a discussion with somebody who was only drinking Diet Coke. A few years ago, 10 years ago, something like that. And I said, oh yeah, but apparently there's some kind of connection. And she said, oh yes, sir. And she's a scientist, so she was annoying. She said, could you send me the links to that? And I of course said, okay, sure. And I went out looking for them. And it turned out there was no such articles. What I have been fooled by was before I started being able to kind of look at articles, see if they're fake or not, that I've been taken in by science-looking articles. All those fake campaigns. I still don't know who was behind it, but that was kind of what had taken me in. And I wouldn't have revisited it if I hadn't been challenged. So it's also a good idea if other people challenge us once in a while. Can you just provide the evidence of what you just said? Don't do it all the time. There's nothing more annoying than say, what's the evidence? The old citation needed. That's just annoying. But
yeah, but you ought to be, anyone ought to be able to provide minimal citations. I mean, you don't have to give us a treatise on it, but asking, give me another source so I can go look this up and see if that's the case or not. Yeah, I mean, one example I've run into, and I did a lot of research on this, was glyphosate, Roundup. And I've got big containers of it over in my lab because we were testing that stuff over and over again. And I was shocked at how little it would do. I throw these delicate little fish embryos in it. They're practically swimming in pure glyphosate and nothing would happen. I mean, I could throw them into a little bit of alcohol and get all kinds of things happening, but got glyphosate? No, it was just, you had to worry about things like pH and stuff like that, but otherwise, no, it doesn't seem to do much of anything. And that, here I am, a good old-fashioned environmentalist progressive sort of guy, and that was a problem because here I am in favor of an herbicide. Yeah.
All right. Well, I mean, that bleeds into the next one too. Quantification. If whatever it is you're explaining has some measure, some numerical quantity attached to it, you'll be much better able to discriminate amongst competing hypotheses. What is vague and qualitative is open to many explanations. Of course, there are truths to be sought in many qualitative issues we are obliged to confront, but finding them is more challenging. Sort of. I mean, honestly, no. I think
can I say just one small phrase, and then I'm going back out the IQ.
Sure. Yes.
Hey, you can measure it. You can get a number. Therefore, it's true.
Exactly. That's. I understand what he's saying, but I don't think that's not right. I mean, we all know IQ is nonsense, but it's measurable.
Yeah. Yeah, there we're getting into, there's a counter principle there. If you've got too many numbers, it's really easy to lying with statistics. And you can just get buried in all the noise. And then of course you can start making up whatever you want. Currently the one that kind of bugs me is genome-wide association studies. Boy, there's a lot of numbers there, and I don't believe 9/10 of them. I don't think if they've extracted the truth from these numbers, but there's an awful lot of money going into these GWAS studies, and
But that's more important now,
the
the
money.
amount of money. Yeah.
Yes, yes. Yeah. And it's long been a principle about lying with statistics that if you get enough numbers, you can rationalize just about anything with them, that they can be used to obscure the core principle that you're trying to identify.
You can use them in all sorts of misleading ways. I mean, this is something that comes up a lot in medicine when you're looking at, have you all heard about the difference between relative risks and absolute risks and numbers needed to treat or to harm?
Mhm.
Give us a summary if you can, actually.
Well, basically, supposing you a drugs company doing an experiment on your new drug, and you say this doubles the chances of remission from cancer, and that sounds terribly exciting. Then it turns out that the actual chance of remission from cancer is 1%, and what you've done is increased it to 2%. That makes it sound less exciting. I mean, yes, you've doubled the figures, but that sounds a lot better than it does, when in fact what you've done is given yourself an extra 1 in 100 chance of getting remission from cancer by taking that drug. So that's a bunch of made up figures thrown out as an example, but hopefully you get the idea. It's describing the same figure in different ways to make it sound better or worse or more accurate. And it's one of the things we get taught that and this is something I remember coming into awareness in the time I've been in medicine. Really, it's back in the 90s, this wasn't really a thing people were aware of, and most doctors wouldn't have had a clue what that sort of thing is all about. And since then, it's the kind of generally read journals that your average doctor would be looking at, that you have to not just look at the relative risks or p-values or whatever. You look at the numbers, in terms of how many people out of 100 are going to be helped by a treatment, how many people are going to be harmed by it. Those are the figures you need to be looking at. It's just a more accurate way of looking at the figures.
Yeah, perhaps just relevant in particular to Sarah. I was just reading about Ben Goldacre just coming out with a big set of recommendations for health management data, where again you don't just say, okay, well, I got numbers, therefore I've got truth. It's like he's got a whole bunch of recommendations for good data hygiene and for good data organization and extracting useful information from them. Yeah, numbers are complicated, and
as a GP, I've got the job of getting this across to people in the day-to-day. Like, if you take this drug, these are your chances of getting a heart attack compared with this chance if you don't take them, and trying to explain that in ways that the average person with probably no training in statistics is going to understand. And then making them aware that also at the end of the day, it's not just about your numbers, but about your personal preferences. And, as I tell people, I can say, okay, if you take this drug, you have such and such a chance of benefit, such and such a chance of side effects, but I can give you the figures. You're the only one who can decide what that means to you in terms of your preferences and whether or not you want to take this drug.
mm-hmm.
Yeah, agreed. I'm mostly in agreement on this one, but I do sort of remember the case of Susan Brown Miller. If you look before the 1970s or so, the literature on sexual assault was really terrible, quite frankly. Mostly, they would just sort of interview like prison inmates and sort of ask, okay, why did you do it, and blah blah blah. What happened actually in the early 70s was a bunch of feminist authors and activists came out and had sort of like speak outs where they would have, people sort of come forward and talk about their experiences with sexual assault, which led Susan Brunner to come up with her groundbreaking book, what is it, Against Her Will or something like that?
Yeah,
I forgot.
I guess I will.
Thank you.
I guess I will. The way all women are, all men are prison, all women or something like that. It has a pretty striking subtitle. I have it somewhere in here, but I don't know where to find it right now.
And it's an example of how qualitative research can have a huge impact, because that basically changed the entire way that we were talking about sexual assault, both in the public and within the scientific literature too. It led to a complete revolution with new metrics for how to actually measure and carry things out. So even though Carl Sagan does actually say, hey, qualitative, metrics are useful too. He agrees with that. It's still sort of worth underscoring that it's not as simple as saying, quantitative better, qualitative worse. It's more complicated than that.
Yeah, and I think we're going to find with all the new machine learning and computer data science happening, the data is going to be more and more a key component of problem areas, probably. I mean, they're all garbage in, garbage out, but the problem is now part of the garbage, the assumptions put behind the data gathering and the data analysis and stuff. And that affects, I mean, that's always affected say, biology and the medicine way. We kind of had to interpret whatever this means. But now the tools have become so widespread, it's going to be worse, I think. We need to figure out how to. I mean, we computer scientists need to figure out how to do it our job properly. That's the problem.
All right. Any final thoughts before I move us on to point number 7? Oh, looking good. All right. This is a bit of an awkward transition here. So 7. If there's a chain of argument, every link in the chain must work, including the premise, not just most of them. I don't know. I'd say that one's okay.
Yeah.
It's hard to say it's wrong.
Right.
I mean, surely there's a scope there for saying, okay, we have a chain of argument that looks promising, but where we can't substantiate every link in it. But perhaps at some point in the future, someone will come along and find proof for the links we've missed, and we'll build on our work. I mean, as I understand it, that's a thing that happens in science.
You mean some kind of missing link concept?
I think it's more like, for instance, when I think about signaling pathways, for instance, you get all this chain of steps that are going on. And it's really easy to look at a paper with a diagram of that and say, oh, well, we got the whole thing. But then you don't know every detail. And so intermediate links are probably affected by other phenomena as well. And you can't just pretend that the entire chain is complete and you're done. That you have to recognize that some of the links are kind of, they're not wrong, but there may be more complicating issues that affect those links as well.
But I think as it was said, it is standing by itself. I mean, in the sense that we have to disregard if there's a premise and a link of arguments, and just one of them is wrong, we have to disregard it, or
Right.
at least we have to disregard it after that certain point and say, "Of this point was right. Whatever happens after that, we need to take another look at."
Mm-hmm.
Probably the worst I can say about this is it's not really how science itself behaves. Quite often, because the real world is messy and all that, we actually settle for finding correlations rather than actual strict causations between various stages on there. And so scientists will just sort of say, well, okay, we observe a correlation or something, good enough. We'll figure out, the details later on. So it's not even sort of really making an argument per se. It's just sort of vaguely hand waving and being like, okay, we'll fill in the details later, but there's something here at least, which is certainly worthy of looking at.
Yeah.
All right, well, let's get on to point 8, in fact. Occam's razor. Convenient rule of thumb This convenient rule of thumb argues us. This convenient rule of thumb urges us, when faced with two hypotheses that explain the data equally well, to choose the simpler.
Where choosing means subject that particular option to further testing. That's all it means. Yeah, it's a heuristic, right? For designing your experiments. You got two alternatives here. One's really complicated and hard to test. This one's really easy to test. Test the easy one first and see if you can rule it out.
I think that's a really important point, because that's not how you use Occam's razor in skeptic talk.
Oh, yes.
So I think it's really important point is, no, you can't say that you have to pick the easiest one as the right one, because you can't know. I mean, it could be the wrong one. But
yes,
if you want to test it, yes, it's probably good to start by the easy testing.
Yeah, I actually go over Occam's razor quite a bit in my introductory biology course, and I always have an exam question where I give, it's even just a simple multiple choice. Occam's razor is used to determine the truth of a statement, the plausibility of a statement, etc. And there's always some students who get it wrong and think it actually is a way to determine what's right. But we're in biology. I got to tell them, no, the simplest solution is usually the wrong one in biology.
Oh, yeah. I mean, I have a lot of sympathy for this too, especially from an information theory kind of thing. You can actually construct some very elegant arguments arguing for Occam's razor as just sort of a general rule of thumb. Again, the main critique is just it's a rule you should be follow. It's a rule you follow absent anything else. Once other things sort of come into play, that does interrule it. And speaking on misconceptions too, it's something we often find within religious circles too, where they say, well, you use a variety of disparate explanations to explain these various evolutionary processes. Well, I have just one thing, God, and that explains it. Therefore, by Occam's razor, I should be correct.
There's a lot of apologetics that sits around trying to argue that the God concept is ultimately really simple, when it's not. It's the most complicated answer for anything I can imagine.
It's just a matter of the right assumptions. Given one God, God is right.
Sure. Yeah. Just give me that little piece, citation needed. Give me
I'm sure that our friend Satan will agree that if Satan exists, God must exist, and then.
I mean, the thing is, I think it falls foul of point 9, which we're shortly going to get onto, that the idea that God did it is, technically could be the explanation and is the simplest one, but it's also effectively unfalsifiable.
Yeah, and the fact that you can condense it into 3 words is not a point in its favor.
I can detail very detailed, complicated algorithms in just one word. That doesn't make them simple. That means I've actually attached this label to a very complicated process, which allows me to convey it, communicate it in a very short way. There's not necessarily that correlation between it's very simple to say and it is very simple. Period. But now that Sarah's brought it up, let's might as well move on to point 9 as well. Always ask whether hypotheses can be, at least in principle, falsified. Propositions that are untestable, unfalsifiable are not worth much. Consider the grand idea that our universe and everything in it is just an elementary particle, an electron, say, in a much bigger cosmos. But if we can never acquire information from outside our universe, is not the idea incapable of disproof? You must be able to check assertions out. Invertebrate skeptics must be given the chance to follow your reasoning, to duplicate your experiments, and see if they get the same result.
I think
Yeah.
that's probably one we agree with all of us the most, probably.
Yeah, I mean, I agree with it, but I would say that falsifiability is not sufficient. That you've got to get deeper into it. That again, it's another useful heuristic, but it's not necessarily the one that leads you to the truth.
Well, yeah, and we know, in fact, that, quantum mechanics and general relativity are false because the two contradict one another. So there has to be some other theory which sort of explains all these phenomenon without sort of invoking either of those two. The thing is, though, basically we've searched all the easy spots to find this thing. So whatever theory that's going to come up is going to necessarily be something which we can't really test immediately. The classic example of this is string theory. Nobody's really come up with any good test to actually tell whether or not, string theories or, any of the various string theories that are out there actually correspond with reality. It doesn't necessarily rule them out, although it is a reason for skepticism in general, and you find a lot of, people sort of dismissing string theories on that regard. But at some point, I mean, we are sort of, you know, we are struggling to actually find data for our hypotheses sometimes, and that's not necessarily a bad thing.
I mean, string theories has some other problems, in my opinion. The simple fact that they can't explain it in a way that's meaningful for anybody, but a very, very small group of people kind of means that it's not really a necessary hypothesis for most of us. It's like, I have spoken with people who understand string theory. They're not easy people to understand. Holger Beck Nielsen, who's one of the most incredible physicists in the world, who also was the guy who kind of assumed when they start the big collider that the boson particle will go back in time and explode the machine so it couldn't be found or something like that. He was really out there. He's really into string theory, and yeah, he at least said that his hypothesis about the boson particle going back in time was obviously wrong. He will admit that. So he's a healthy skeptic in that sense.
I guess, yeah.
So
yeah,
I think he will call himself a scientist.
Yeah, it sort of brings up something that Hemi Scott mentioned in the chat too about falsification and its limits. Unfortunately, I'm not aware of 10M Queen and all that. I should probably look up that one after the chat and all that to see what exactly is up with it. But I do agree that falsification definitely does have limits. You actually sort of find this with the sort of two statistical methods which are battling it out within science itself. You've got frequentism on one side, and Bayesian statistics on the other. Frequentist statistics is very much sort of built around a hardcore sort of falsification, i.e., you cannot actually ever prove anything is true, but you can, however, disprove that in fact it is true. And so you sort of go about and sort of essentially sort of carving off all possible hypotheses and just sort of leaving behind the true-ish ones that are there. The problem with that, of course, is you don't ever really sort of come up with anything in favor of any hypothesis. And underneath Bayesian statistics, in contrast, you actually can come up with things which are in favor of hypotheses. And quite often, when we're actually sort of when you look at how science itself is carried out, it's more than just simply falsification. The classic example of this is faster than light neutrinos. There's a paper published. I think it's probably going to be a good decade at this point, where a team of scientists, went in, checked their collider and all that, and found potential evidence for neutrinos traveling faster than the speed of light. If science really did sort of obey from falsification, here is something which actually falsifies that, light has a set speed limit. This in theory should have caused people to sort of have skepticism on the theories themselves. In practice, that's not actually what happened. Basically, any physicist worth their salt was like, no, this is going to go away. It's not going to be an issue. Why was that? Well, it's because over the years, general relativity had so much evidence in its favor that one or two contrary observations wasn't enough to sort of falsify it or sort of reduce its metric in any significant way. It's not that it had been, it's not just that it had been carved away. It actually had evidence built in its favor. So in practice, you actually do get, yes, falsification just is not exactly how science itself goes forward. It's a mix of sort of building evidence for things as well as, tearing evidence away or showing evidence to the contrary.
Well, but I mean, yeah. As I said, falsification is 25 years, 30 years ago, there was that cold fusion debacle where somebody decided to make cold fusion at home. And as my brother, who actually studied physics at the time, kind of mentioned, was cold is only relatively cold. So, I mean, if they did it, there would be a small city missing because the heat generated by cold fusion is still quite hot. So that's an easy plausible one if people, the journalists, had just known a little bit about it. But the thing is, that kind of stuff, you could easily do a falsifiable thing. But as I said, the other stuff, if somebody finds something flies against normal knowledge, well, don't disregard biology, chemistry, and physics just yet. Let's just check if there might be a mistake somewhere. And I mean, in medicine, it happens all the time that they find new groundbreaking cures, but that doesn't mean that they're all cures are wrong necessarily. It just means that these now, we just know more now. I mean, one of the things COVID had taught us a lot about how to deal with those in a different way than we did before. It doesn't mean that we were wrong before in the way sometimes we were, but not always wrong in all the stuff we did before. So we have to kind of be careful. Okay.
All right,
Yeah, it's fair. You learn something, and then it turns out that it only applies in a particular situation, and there's this other situation where it doesn't. Like a fairly obvious example being the fundamentalist Christians who tell you no, life cannot spontaneously evolve from non-life, and we know this because Pasteur proved it back in the 18th or 19th centuries. I've lost track of where he was. And no, actually what he proved was that in those specific circumstances of having a lump of sterilized meat in current time and place, then life doesn't spontaneously appear out of non-life in those circumstances, which isn't the same as could life have appeared from non-living things in the primordial soup 4.5 billion years ago. So yeah, sometimes you just find that what was right in one context is actually not covering it in another.
And in
sorry, I have to say, I'm just kind of amazed by that. I had not heard that creationists actually invoked a disproof of spontaneous generation as a back in the 19th century or whatever as a disproof for like a origin of life in the primal
in the 19th century. They're doing it now in the 21st century.
That's well, I love creationists. They're no, I don't. They're incredibly, profoundly depressing.
Yeah.
Yeah, I think another example of that was, why has no one ever observed life coming out of a jar of peanut butter? And it's like, that's
guy.
not,
yeah.
That's not the proper conditions to start life and all that.
I love the theory of spontaneous generation, like the old, like, Middle Ages type science on that. That like, maggots would be born out of non-living matter, like, and then manifest and turn into this, that, and the other thing. I like the pre-scientific version of that. I just I hate seeing like a disproof of alchemy as being like used as a disproof of legitimate science. That's good grief.
I mean, I'm sure you will find somebody actually using just about every argument about any type of wannabe science as an argument for God. I mean, they're really good at reading only half of the argument and repeating it.
Yeah, true. All right, we are pretty much coming up on our time here. I would have loved to talk about the reproducibility crisis and all that, but there's just simply nowhere near enough time to do it, and certainly not in enough depth. So I think we should probably just wrap up here. So I will ask everybody what their final thoughts are on Carl Sagan's Baloney detection kit and how well it's held up. Might as well start off with the Christian, actually, just to see what you have to say on it.
I mean, it's a fine set of guidelines. It's not. I mean, it's a little bit dated. It's a little bit naive, but it's a fine set of guidelines if you follow it. But I mean, just have to get general guideline of being skeptical, but also don't be overly skeptical. For sometimes, people fall over the other cliff. People know about the subject a lot more than you. Tell you something, give them the benefit of the doubt until you find out you actually have a bit more knowledge, right?
All right, PZ, what do you think?
Well, yeah, what Christian said is that, I kind of feel the same way, that it's a good set of general guidelines, but it can also be abused and become too restrictive. I mean, one of the causes for my falling out with the skeptic movement, whatever that is, was the fact that it got kind of locked into insisting that the only thing they were going to look at are things that can be tested empirically in a day, basically. So sure, dowsing, yeah, we will be skeptical of dowsing, and we'll go on there. We can devise experiments that you can do one-shot experiments where you can show that dowsing is nonsense. And they thought that was the only form of skepticism that counted. So for instance, things that involve sociology or religion or anything like that, oh, that's just too complicated. We can't do that. That's not good skepticism because there's so many other phenomena going on. So the toolkit is a really good toolkit, but just don't stitch it into a straitjacket.
All right, cool. Let's go with Great American Satan. See if you got any.
The regarding the toolkit, I think the naivete can't be understated. There's a lot of people that benefit from a lack of knowledge from people being misinformed. And humans are just like, I keep coming back to this one of my little hobby horses, that humans are extremely excellent at angling. Like on this planet is looking for an angle that benefits itself, and humans have like taken that as the most complicated social animals that ever existed. We've like taken that to like a ridiculous degree, where it's like we work these. Some people figured out how to subvert almost every tool in this kit, like without even really having to put much thought into it. It's like hucksters, con men, politicians, like media, like people on Facebook and all this stuff. Everybody's attacking every aspect of this toolkit, just about. So it's like the well of knowledge, of human knowledge, is so poisoned right now. I don't know how I would begin to advise a layperson on how to think critically in this day and age. I'm kind of lost on that one. The toolkit, theoretically, like an okay base, but I can think of ways in which it's been messed up on almost every level by the ocean of bullshitters. Say la vie.
And I guess the second last word actually to Sarah on the subject as well.
Hi. Not having ever previously come across it before an hour ago, I think it looks potentially excellent. And I think the important thing to remember is, like any tool, it's as good or as ineffective as the people wielding it and their skill and their intellectual honesty and integrity in wielding it correctly, not just to make the points they want to make and try and back them up, but to actually examine the truth properly and see where the evidence leads.
Yeah. And actually, the last word I'm going to give to Hemi Scott in the chat. They did actually bring up an excellent point. Carl Sagan himself was a proponent of the triune brain hypothesis. The idea being sort of that we've got different sort of layers to our brain, like there is in fact sort of like a lizard brain within, which he promoted. It is unfortunately completely bunk, but it's a good example of exactly how people who even seem to be, well clued into skepticism, the sort of nuts and bolts of how it works, can be led astray by their own biases. I think that's a good
Yes,
spot
that's his book, Dragons of Eden, which, oh man, I threw that one across the room because it was so bad. That's what happens when a physicist thinks he knows all of biology.
Yes. Oh, I know it well from my perch in computer science. So
Uh-huh.
I think with that, I shall sign us off then for the day. I think it's been a very illuminating talk. Thank you very much to the chat for coming in, and of course, all the other people who were talking as well. And we shall be seeing you next month for our next stream. So I'll see you then.